Good morning, this is Tim O'Brien reporting to you from Seattle. It's October 26, 2025, and this is an experiment. So I used to write a lot, 15 years ago or so. I was a part-time journalist for O'Reilly Media, and what we did was a few of us, programmers, technologists, people who had written books, were being paid to write news, to cover stories as journalists. And I gotta tell you, it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work. I took it maybe far too seriously. I got a White House press pass. I interviewed Congress people. I traveled to conferences and covered them as a member of the press. It was very interesting to show up at a conference like the Personal Democracy Forum in New York. It was also interesting to be on the White House press corps. I didn't go to the White House, don't get me wrong, but you would get all these announcements about the schedule and what was planned. It was very interesting. I spoke to a lot of people. I'm not going to list out the names, but it was an interesting time. I would have a 1-hour interview with Brian Cox about CERN. Some of you might know him because he shows up on podcasts now that are far more popular than what you're listening to right now. I also got to attend some of the conferences and saw some of the cultural ways in which technology and open source was changing in the first decade of the century. And part of the piece I'm going to cover today talks about that. What I would ask you for as I start this new experiment is a little bit of patience, maybe some forgiveness. I don't necessarily know how to record audio in a professional way, so my de-esser might not be correct, or my EQ might not be set up. I'm still trying to figure out what the format of this medium is, but I have learned something, and that is most people that consume content these days aren't stopping to read a post on a website. I'd say more than half of the audience wants something to listen to. So just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to record 10, 12, 20-minute pieces that you can listen to instead of reading. And you're going to get a little bit more if you listen, but you're probably going to want to read what I wrote as a follow-up. I'm not going to read everything word for word, but I am going to add some notes. So instead of me talking about what I'm doing, let's end this meta conversation and get back into the content, because I think that's what's going to bring people to listen. Okay, and I almost forgot. One warning. I used to record this in an audio format back in my 30s in an office that was in central Evanston. I used to live in Chicago, just north of Chicago in Evanston. And whenever I would record it, my office mate who was in marketing would stop and say, "You're trying to be too newsy. Your voice is too serious." And I'll say, like, my wife, Susan, she is a opera director and a trained actor. She studied at the Piven School for 3 decades, 4 decades, 5 even. And every time she hears me record this stuff, she's like, "Stop trying to be like you're on the news. Like, just talk." So this is going to take some time, but I'm going to try to talk like myself. But I also want you to know I have a little bit of a complication in that I'm maybe the weirdest person alive, and I stutter. So part of how I talk is affected by how I think. And because of my stutter, I end up having to think ahead of most people. I'll probably record a whole nother series on that. I don't want to waste too much more of your time before we get to the content, because like I said, people come here for content. But I am going to try to put a little bit of personality into these recordings. Okay, so let's dive into the content. Yesterday, I wrote a piece called The Fork It and Forget Decade. I talk about the history of open source for the last 3 decades. And I'll give you a quick summary of the piece, but first I'll read something from it. So here it goes. Open source has been evolving for half a century, but in the last 2 decades, they have set the stage for what comes next. The 2000s were the star stage, when open source became mainstream, funded, commercial, and visible. The 2010s decentralized it, breaking the hierarchy and making forking normal. Now, in the 2020s, it's transforming again as Gen AI enters the space as a participant. This decade is not just faster, it's a different kind of speed. So with AR, we're starting to write, refactor, remix code, and open source projects at a scale that no human maintainer can match. GitHub isn't just expanding, it's mutating, it's kind of exploding. And now it's filled with AI-generated derivatives of human work on track to manage close to 1 billion repositories by the end of the decade. So as you hear in that excerpt, the idea is that each of the past few decades has had a really distinct impact on open source. And I summarize these all, maybe in too much detail. In the 1990s, open source began as a kind of a rebellion against the old proprietary order. And I was there. I was in academic computing. And open source was a fundamental part of academic computing. But the platforms themselves were all still very proprietary. In the 2000s, open source went mainstream and it was even a bit star-driven. It was a lot of money that was being poured into open source because it turned it from a rebellion into the foundation of the economy. And by the end of that decade, open source was driving the things that were really generating revenue. The developers themselves in open source became influential rock stars. The 2010s was a great decentralization. And in the piece, I talk about the fact that I think Git drove that. In the early aughts, we were using CVS, we were using Subversion, and that centralization is part of what created that star stage. And that's really the core concept of most of the piece, is that star stage was the thing that made the aughts the open source decade. So the 90s weren't the first decade of open source. Open source had existed before then. I think Richard Stallman got the Free Software Foundation started in 1985. Emacs was something that existed back then as well. James Gosling, the future inventor of Java, was also shipping his own version of Emacs. Everybody was into Lisp. There was free software. By the time I got to college at the University of Virginia, academic computing was dominated by open source tooling, but the platforms were all proprietary. So I was doing Unix help desk support for an organization called ITC. At times I would have to sit in this Unix lab called Small Hall and literally be there on call for someone to ask me any random question about the systems. That meant I had to know Next, I had to know Solaris, I had to know SGI, IRIX, I had to know AIX, I had to know different statistics sorry, my stutter sometimes shows up and I'm not going to hide it on principle. Statistics packages. And it was a really interesting time. I had a couple of jobs at ITC. I was majoring in electrical engineering, but skipping too many classes. And I was much more interested in my jobs with the campus computing system. I worked at the multimedia lab. They were doing new media. I think I worked for somebody named Michael Tuitt at the time. My job was to help with all the Unix boxes. They had some SGI machines in the lab. I remember we took a field trip once as a team to go visit the cave at Virginia Tech, which is this 3D thing that they had based on these massive SGI machines. And part of my job was to be the person who could help figure that stuff out. Well, I was getting sick of all this proprietary Unix stuff, so I remember in 1997 or 1998, I decided I'm going to install Linux on a couple servers because it's new and I want to really use it. It was a pain in the neck, like it wasn't ready yet. But here's what I'm going to say about the 90s. Two big things happened in the 90s. The web. I think what Timothy Berners-Lee did in 1994, that set the stage for the next decade. Oh no, sorry, century. HTML and the work that was done at CERN changed human history. But from a tactical perspective for open source, the thing that set the stage for the next decade was what Linus did with Linux. I think he invented Linux in 1991, but it didn't really become something that people were using widely until 96 or 97. That's when I started to pick it up. It wasn't actually viable until the aughts, and that's the next story. I think the next decade was the decade where open source showed up. So let's talk about the 2000s. So I went to school in Virginia, UVA. I graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. I actually dropped out for a year to try to start a startup, which was a search engine. I'll talk about that at some point. A lightning bolt struck our building and destroyed all of our source code. I went back to college and graduated late. If you graduated in like 98 or 99, it doesn't matter what you majored in, you probably went to go work for a website. So I went to go work for The Street in New York, and just to keep that Linux topic going a little bit further, we weren't running Linux. Like back then, the big websites were running almost fully proprietary stacks, with the exception of Apache HTTP. So we were using that for the front end. But for App Server, it was ATG Dynamo, and for our database, it was this massive Oracle database. And in terms of the hardware that we were running on, I think at thestreet.com we were using E450s, Solaris boxes. Ultimately, maybe we started to buy an E4500. And on those boxes were, multiple JVMs. We weren't having virtual machines yet. Like we were buying large machines and running multiple JVMs on them and then routing to them with mod proxy. But Linux didn't really start to show up until a couple years later. And I think the 2.4 kernel was the transition time when Linux became really usable on the server side. Predictable latency. I think there were some changes to how memory was being managed. But the 2000s were also the decade where all the proprietary systems started to realize, okay, we got to pay attention to open source because it's now an alternative. Linux showing up, FreeBSD showing up, started to change the game. the proprietary actors like Sun, HP, IBM, and Microsoft, towards the end of the decade, started to really embrace and fund open source projects. And so there was a lot of people and money showing up for open source and a lot of foundations. So there's like the Apache Foundation, there's the Eclipse Software Foundation, there's a few other, I'm probably leaving out Mozilla. But during this time, something new started to happen in open source, which is a huge wave of people who were relatively early in their careers started to see open source as a guild. And that happened to me. And it happened slowly and over time. I started to use Ant at Forbes.com. The more I used it, the more I started to say like, oh, hey, there's a mailing list over here I should join. And I started to meet some of the other people that were contributing. And, I still go back and forth with those people even 20 years later. It was a network of people who were all focused on open source. There was a little bit of an altruistic idealism there. I ultimately went on to write a book about Jakarta Commons. Now, Jakarta Commons is still there. It's a great project, but it's also maybe the simplest thing in open source you could think about writing a book on. But I wrote a book on it because everybody was using it. There was really a lack of documentation. I started to get involved in the project. I became a committer. And what I sort of saw back then, and maybe didn't realize at the time, is open source was a bit of a reputation game. Being an open source committer on a major project became a form of social capital. I remember the communities around Apache, Eclipse, Mozilla turned into places where you could say like, I'm a committer on this project, or I'm a committer on Tomcat, or I'm on the core team of Eclipse. And that would help you land a job. It would help you secure funding for your startup. Suddenly the people writing open source were getting recognition and a bit of fame. Something I left out of the story that I wrote was, I remember I was a journalist, a part-time journalist. I'd take a few days off my day job and I'd go attend Java 1 and I'd interview people. So I think at one point I interviewed Jonathan Schwartz, who's the CEO, and I asked him a question about open source, and he kind of bristled at the question. Because open source was a bit of a challenge for Sun, because the Apache Software Foundation was trying to create its own version of a JVM called Geronimo. I remember interviewing Bob Lee. Bob Lee's been in the news recently, by the way. He was a great person, one of the nicest people I've ever encountered in the profession. May he rest in peace. I know there's a lot of news stories out there about the circumstances around his passing, and I just want to say, like, he was a great human being. Bob had this star power about him. He was out there contributing to the Android project. Maybe he created the Android project. I forget. I'm getting old. Bob was one of many. There were people who were like so well known for their open source contributions that it was starting to get a little bit weird, in my opinion. I went to boot camp a couple times. That was interesting to see the dynamics. I went to Sci-Fu once. You would be there and there'd be an open source contributor, like a lead committer on an open source project would be sitting next to Wally Gilbert, the guy who discovered DNA sequencing, or, other people who I won't name because, again, that conference is somewhat secret. But the point is, the way that we view people like Sam Altman now in the 2020s, open source was that in the early aughts. And I'm spending a lot of time on this decade because I think this is the decade where the money showed up and it really funded everything. The important point I'm trying to make here is it was a star stage. Some of you might be surprised that I'm making a biblical reference here, but it created high places. And so I forget what book says it, but I think the Bible talks about, casting down the high places as a good thing. What I saw, at least in my own experience, working with startups and participating in these communities, towards the end of the aughts, there were so many fights about who controls this project and who's influencing this. Is this just a corporate project? Is this person allowed to fork this and do that? Big companies buying other big companies. I think the real thing that was causing all of this was the centralization of open source. In the aughts, if you had an open source project and you saw somebody go and fork it, it was like they wanted to start a war with you. Like, what are they doing? Somebody's forking struts. What are they going to go do? Replace struts? It was that way because of the technology. CVS was the first source control system that I was exposed to at Apache. And then we moved to Subversion, which was itself an Apache project. Great products. Like, I have no problems with those products, by the way. But it was tough to fork something. It was tough to fork it and then keep it up to date. I remember working on a CVS project commercially in Chicago. CVS was wonderful, but it could destroy you. Subversion was better, but Git shows up with some controversy in 2006. And Linus is like, we're using Git. No conversation. We're done. Here's what I'm going to do. And it might shock people. I think that the introduction of Git, the quiet introduction of Git in 2006, it took a few years for people to realize it. That was the most important thing that happened in the aughts. So again, the award for biggest tactical win goes to Linus Torvalds 2 decades in a row, because introducing Git and the approach of decentralizing open source fundamentally changed the power dynamics. It was the solution that we needed to find for some of these open source hierarchies that were becoming problematic. So that brings us to the 2010s. Let's talk about the tens a little bit. I was a part-time tech journalist for O'Reilly for a couple of years, and it was interesting. I had a White House press pass, and I interviewed a lot of interesting people. But it wasn't necessarily paying the bills, and I really had to focus on my career. I was a consultant at the time, and I was working for a startup, and I really needed to just focus on that. So I dialed back from journalism a little bit, but every once in a while I'd call up someone like Mike Lakides, and we'd talk about the state of open source. And my observation in the 2010s and the 2011 is it was starting to become balkanized. And I hesitate to use the term balkanized because I don't know the real root of how that term came into use. But to me, when I say balkanized, I mean it was a number of small projects starting to diverge from each other in ways that were incompatible. Now, I viewed this at the time as a bad thing, because here's the thing I want to confess in this format. I was part of the reputation game in the aughts. I was super into the whole, like, well, I'm a committer on this project, and oh, that person's a committer over there. And initially when Git was released, I was like, oh, Git would never work. How would we control the project if we could just use Git? And I wasn't the only one saying that. I remember that there was some controversy at Apache. People want to use Git. There was some pushback on it. But I started to dial back from open source. I really had to work. I really had to focus on my career. I think a lot of people were in the same situation, by the way. I talked to a lot of people, and they were like really into open source in the first decade of the century. And then they were still into open source in the second decade, but maybe not as much. And so I sort of lost connection with Apache. I lost connection with some of those teams, and I started to experience open source more in terms of the projects I was working on and at work. And what I'll say is, Git just started to happen. And it showed up. It just started to show up and define how we did open source. It wasn't something that we talked about so much as somebody on the project would say, we're using Git. And a bunch of people would fall in line. And then suddenly we all realized, hey, Git's way better than Subversion. It's easier to use. Merging and branching is not trivial, but it's not rocket science. I remember Matthew McCullough and I were working on a project together at the time. He later went on to work for GitHub, and it was something that was a natural move. 2011, 2012, using Git, starting to move to GitHub, and GitHub just took over. So by the end of the 2010s, anyone that said the word open source was probably talking about Git, and most likely talking about GitHub. I want to be fair. There's other alternatives to GitHub. There's GitLabs, and they're all wonderful. So I don't want anybody to listen to this and say I'm being unfair. But I use GitHub. I use a lot of GitHub. In the piece, I talk about how Git and the decentralization that enabled, that led to what I call a Cambrian era. If you want to look at the Cambrian era, go look it up. It's an age in geological history in which there was a massive increase in the number of species, right? And I think that's what we saw in open source. The 2010s were all about open source, and especially the newer communities that showed up. You look at the Node.js folks, the JavaScript folks, the front-end teams, React. The React community right now is an example of a community that has a lot of healthy competition. It's not a big deal if you go create a new front-end framework. It's not a big deal if you fork something and innovate. That decade, the decade of the aughts established open source as the thing to do. The decade of the tens, it really increased the amount of open source out there, to the point where we get to 2020 and software is open source. If you're not using open source, you are living in a weird cabin in the middle of Montana. Again, no offense to Montana. Montana has great skiing. I'm not trying to make enemies on this recording. I think that's the story about the 2010s. Now, granted, other people might have other things that they're going to point to as being the biggest thing in the world, but for me, the 2010s was the great decentralization. It was when open source became ubiquitous and numerous. So now we're in the 2020s, and I don't think you can name a decade until you're out of it, probably a number of years. I don't think we're going to be able to name the 2020s until like 2034. And hopefully we have a good name for the 2020s, because the 2020s is full of a lot of concerning news. But let's focus on open source, because again, I said I want this series of recordings to be an alternative to doom scrolling, which I know a lot of you are doing. If you look at what is happening in the early years of the 2020s, it's similar to the 10s. But then Gen AI hits, and Gen AI really hit. It hit in a way that reminded me of what Tim Berners-Lee did in 1994. In 1994, I was still young. I was 18. I was a big geek in high school. I was skipping parties and going and dialing into BBSs. And it was cool. I was using a Y modem and Z modem. And then my father started taking a class at VCU. I took a class at VCU as well, and I got access to these Unix machines. And I discovered Gopher, and Gopher was magnificent. It was like, what is this? This is like the world is at my fingertips. And it was text-based. It was links. You could create pages. The web came around, and I remember as an 18-year-old thinking, this is going to change everything. This is my career. This is what I'm going to do. And so even though I was majoring in electrical engineering, I was really focused more on like the web and Java at the time, which was also new. This Gen AI thing hit, and a lot of us that were around there see the same thing. It may even be bigger than the web. I don't know. But there's so much activity around it. It's tough for us to predict what it's going to do in 7 or 8 years. And I want to go back to the web in the 1990s to make that case. When the web was released, I was psyched that it would help with like science and news, and it did those two things, but it definitely had some other effects on the world. The thing that we know as the web right now didn't really show up until the middle of the aughts. Like social networking showed up. Advertising started to shape how news is presented. The revenue didn't really show up then. Gen AI is in this weird state where I think we're accelerating it. And from a programming perspective, no one has any idea what's even possible yet. And so here is what I will say about vibe coding. Vibe coding is dumb. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but like showing up to a ChatGPT prompt and saying like, make me a cool Darth Vader game or something, or make me a Space Invaders game where I can move the cursor and shoot things up. That's cool. That's awesome. I think that's phenomenal. But it's not coding, right? Coding is when you break down a complex problem that has multiple, like 20, 30 libraries that are interoperating with each other, and you ask a model like Opus, hey, I want you to look at this API, I want you to look at this API, I want you to iterate on this 10 times, I want you to come up with some recommendations for how you think that they should be operating, and I want you to come up with some evidence and some tests. And it's those multi-hour, sometimes multi-$1,000 jobs, those are the things that are going to change open source, because I'm already using it. I'm already using it to do things to open source libraries I use. It's interesting, right? Like, for example, I was throwing it at a logging library the other day, and I was like, I really need you to figure out how to buffer your output more so that you're not introducing any extra I/O overhead on this particular operation. Or, hey, this is a logging library, but I need you to connect it to this other library that's going to be able to identify personally identifiable information outbound. And I let the thing go for like an hour or two, and it comes back, and it's forked an open source project. It's patched it a couple times. It's connected it to another open source project in a way I could have not anticipated. And that is, I think, the way software is going to be written at an advanced level going forward. Now, I'm still writing code. I'm still getting into it. I'm still understanding what it's doing. But there is a ratio of code that Gen AI wrote versus code that I wrote. And that ratio is getting higher and higher. Now, I'll say this, as a professional, even if Gen AI writes the code, what I'll say is you still need to be able to debug it, understand it, rewrite it. That's a very different story than vibe coding. That's not a 5-minute demo that you can give on stage when you release a new model. But what I say in the piece is, I think if we move forward in time, there's going to be 1 billion repos on GitHub. There's going to be a percentage of those repositories that humans have never maybe even looked at. Some of them are going to be under open source licenses. I think this is already happening. I named it the fork it and forget decade, which I'm not allowed to do. You're not allowed to name a decade until you're out of it. But one of the reasons I named it that was to be a little bit controversial, because I think this decade is going to see a lot of projects, a lot of open source code, mind you, that nobody really fully understands because they don't have to. It's been patched. It's been remixed. It's going to be out there. And your agent forked it, so you can forget about it. Because at the end of the day, maybe that's the license that we all have now, which is the agents can do the open source for us. I'll put this out there as a challenge. What do you think about that? Now, again, thank you for listening to this probably longer than I had anticipated experiment. Again, know that this is the first, hopefully of many. We'll see what happens. If you like it, I would say, well, actually, I would ask you to like it on YouTube or on whatever podcast system you consume this on. If you want more of it, please send me feedback. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can find me on X, although I hesitated. I still call it Twitter. I think I might be on Blue Sky. I'm all over the place. But if you want to give me feedback, do that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Also, would love to hear from you if you disagree. If there's anything I have learned, it's that the stuff I do generates a lot of negative feedback. And what I want to say to you before you just start going to the comment thread and calling me an idiot is, I already know I'm an idiot. You don't need to tell me that. I love getting into good, constructive arguments with people. And I think I successfully made it through my first podcast episode without saying anything political. So there's that. Been wonderful talking, and I hope to have more for you in the coming weeks.